No, it's not working for you?
That's what I'm asking.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Those of you who are here and those of you who are watching online. This is a special meeting for Kent School District Board, which is held in public to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. The purpose of this meeting is a work session to discuss culture and communities with Ms. Simone Hamilton, Director of Equity and Strategic Engagement, as well as a legal review with Mr. Paul Fraga, General Counsel. Now, I want to start with the roll call. Director Hamada.
Present.
Director Margel is excused absent. Director Beno.
I'm present.
Director Clark.
Present.
Now we are 2.01, Cultural Community Discussion with Mr. Simone Hamilton. Superintendent, would you please do the introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you, Vice President Farrar. I'd like to introduce to our board, Ms. Simone Hamilton, our Director of Equity and Strategic Engagement, who is going to kick our evening off tonight.
Thank you, Superintendent Vela. Good evening, directors of the board. Here's this.
Oh, good.
So I printed out a copy of the presentation today, too, for you to follow along with. And then, you know, I'm a big person when we're having conversations around communities, cultures, understanding ourselves, what that means in relation to our context, that as much participatory and engagement as we can, the better. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off. I want to first start just opening with an acknowledgement that we would like to acknowledge the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, who are the traditional stewards of this land. We offer our respect to the ancestors and the elders of these lands and extend that respect to other elders present. So today we're going to be reviewing some stuff, and I just want to create some invitations to the space. So the first is emotional honesty. So staying true to yourself and all the things that we talk about today, that we're reflecting on today, that we're doing some inquiry around. So just staying true to who you are. Vulnerability, so giving yourself permission to show up and to be seen. That doesn't mean that, you know, I'm a big person on not oversharing and making sure that when you're sharing or you're speaking or you're engaging, it's from a healthy, healed space as much as possible. But sometimes engaging in that vulnerability to share that stuff can be a little bit scary. It can be a little bit anxiety-ridden, and you can sometimes get caught up in not knowing what to say. And so I just want to invite everybody here to just invite that vulnerability in here. And lastly, patience. There's real big power in the pause. Sometimes we're quick to want to fill in an answer or to find the right answer or to make meaning of something, and sometimes just pausing and letting something sit in the space, let it sit in ourselves and our minds and our hearts, to make meaning of it, to munch on it, is the most powerful thing that we can do. I also commit that whatever we do today, everything I do and that I ask will be from a place of kindness, reasonability, and constructiveness, or whatever that is. But those are kind of how I enter into the spaces when I work with people, is that I'll never ask people or any of us to engage in something that I myself wouldn't do, and that isn't kind, reasonable, and constructive. The goals for our time today is to really review our shared language of what equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging are, and then to build our understanding around positionality and intersectionality. When we think about a place like Kent with as much diversity in our cultures and our communities, if we're not aware of who we are, like what our resting state is, our ground zero, we're entering into spaces not cognizant of what we bring into those spaces with us, whether that's power in certain spaces, privilege in certain spaces, likeness in certain spaces, or differences. And so before we start engaging in communities and really understanding the other communities that are in here, we have to really understand our own community and our own cultures and where that starts from. So does that sound good? Good? Great. Awesome.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to review these four things we're going to kind of go through them a little bit quickly, because I know for a lot of us they'll be review, but I always love to just level set, and especially in the context. I think a lot of things can have working definitions, things evolve, and so for the sake of our time together, I want to make sure we're all operating on the same playing field about how we want to define these things. So the first is equity, and I would actually love to invite Director Hamada to read these bullets for us for the space. Yeah, you. I would love it if you would read some of those.
I would be, I'm more than happy to help.
You're making my day, Leslie.
Equity, and I'm assuming it's under equity.
Yep, all those bullets, the three
Okay,
bullets. Yep.
equity is a process that ensures everyone has access to the same opportunities.
Yeah.
Equity appreciates that privileges and barriers exist. Equity is an approach that starts with acknowledging this unequal starting place and makes efforts to address and change this imbalance.
Perfect. Are we all in agreement on that? Does that feel reasonable? Does that feel like a good definition of that? Awesome. Okay. And again, too, I think it's really important that when we're talking about equity, that it is a process. It's a by way we're making sure that there's fair in access, that there is a fairness in an experience, and a fairness of what's provided for people within that space. The next one is diversity, and I'd love to ask Director Tim Clark to read the bullet here for us.
Diversity is the presence in an organization or a community of a wide range of people with different backgrounds, abilities, and attributes.
Yep, and a lot of these things are things like ethnicity, race, religion, age, gender, sexual orientation, but also diversity in thought and how we think, where we come from, what those things are. Are we all good on that definition there? Sharing that? Awesome, I love it. Next is inclusion, and I'd love to have Director Benno. Joe Benno read these bullets for us.
Inclusion refers to taking into account differences among individuals and groups when designing something to avoid creating barriers. Inclusion is about people with different identities feeling or being valued and welcomed within a given setting.
I love that. And I think, I love to think about, too, where there's this idea of, like, diversity is, like, getting asked to the party, but inclusion is, like, being asked to dance at the party. So you can bring people to the space, but are you included in that space?
Oh, yeah.
Do I feel that there's something for me to do into that space? So are we good there? Good kind of on that? Awesome. And last is belonging. And I'm hoping, Director Wally-Fair, you can read this one for us.
Okay, belonging. Belonging is the extent to which people feel appreciated, validated, accepted, and treated fairly with an environment.
Exactly, and to keep on that analogy of, like, diversity is having the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, but belonging is like knowing the dance you're being asked to dance. So belonging is actually dancing a dance that's authentic to who you are, authentic to your cultures, your communities, those things that you're a part of. So how do we feel on those? Do we feel good about equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging? And to kind of wrap it home, I put together a diagram to show that equity is a process. It's not an outcome. It's about a process that we're consistently engaging in to ensure there's access to resources and opportunities are provided for all to succeed and grow regardless of their identity. Now, diversity, it is an outcome. You say things like, wow, this company's really diverse. It's a fact, it's a thing. Same thing with inclusion, it's an outcome. We do frequent internal checks or temperature checks to see how people are doing this and that. There's many ways that we can measure or understand the outcome of inclusion. But belonging is a feeling. So belonging is really a feeling, and that's something that's unique to each individual. And when inclusionary work is done correctly, that diversity that gets into this space begins to cultivate feelings of belonging there. I think another kind of fun way to put it is that diversity is a fact. That's the numbers, they are what they are. Inclusion is a choice. You decide whether to include someone or not, but belonging is a feeling that can be enforced by a culture that you can purposely create. So when we think about how all these work together, when we stop at just thinking about equity and diversity, or we stop at just inclusion, we miss out on that individual is experiencing this space, these things, these aspects that we're providing. How are we feeling on that as far as on this, we're moving together on that? Any questions coming up for you right now around that? Yeah, go for it.
Inclusion, that could be a two-way street too, because you may feel you're including them, but the person may not feel included, right?
That part.
Is that kind of
That's where it's kind of a belonging thing. So like you can include somebody, absolutely. I can have you at the table. I can have somebody that's different than me at the table. Then I've achieved diversity, I've achieved inclusion, but whether that person feels actually included is connected to their sense of belonging. Do they feel like they belong at this space that they've been included in? And I think we can all think about an experience where we've been included somewhere, but you show up where you're there and you're like, I don't feel that this is a space I actually belong in to be here, given how the space is set up.
And that can take a while to feel like you belong, even though people can be very kind to you and
Yep, and that's why we work on things, whether we're supervisors or we're teachers or we're in these spaces to learn strategies and characteristics of cultures that cultivate belonging and really try and reinforce and invest in that. But ultimately, too, it's a product of a culture of like where you feel like you belong in that, and belonging is always changing. It's always changing. So, you always talk about, like, I used to feel like I belonged in this space, but now I don't feel like I belong in this space. Or I now belong in a space I never thought I did. Those things change. They're connected to how we're growing as humans, the different spaces we're in, and then how we're making meaning of those spaces. Good? Awesome. So the next kind of to move into is this idea of like a shared understanding of how these things kind of go into play. So now that we've spent some time reflecting on equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how our social identities and the positionality and the privileges and their intersections and how that plays out. Because again, back to, we have to know what our ground zero is before we start really being in community with others and understanding other people's culture. So positionality. This is, there's kind of different ways to think about positionality, but really what I'm hoping to offer to this space is that it's referring to the personal values, views, and location and time and space that influence how one engages with and understands the world. It's also wrapped up in the dynamics of power and privilege. So for example, your gender, your race, your class, other aspects of your social identities influence and inform how you move through the world. I don't move through the world as just a black woman. I move through the world or just as a black person. I move through the world as a black woman, as a cisgender black woman, as a daughter of a single parent. Like there's all these parts of my identities that inform how I move through spaces, and those parts of my identities also afford me power and privilege or disprivilege and disempowerment in certain spaces. Moreover, positionality is experienced differently in different contexts, and it can dictate how much access you have in society or how much you don't have, and the power inherent in that. So I love to put over here too is this idea of we're products of our context. I say this a lot. So when we're interrogating things that we do, that we say, how we move, how we make meaning in spaces, it's really a product of our context. How we were raised, where did we grow up, the communities we've been a part of, the people I surround myself now with. All of those are contexts that shape who we are and how we do our belief work. When I have conversations around bias with educators and lead spaces around that, I offer biases are not bad. We all have biases, and frankly, a lot of times biases can be in place to protect us. Like learning that like when that thing is bright red, it's probably hot. I have a bias that when things are glowing red, it's probably that, and probably because I've touched it before and I've burned myself. Versus biases that are shaped by potentially misinformation. The trick with biases is it's not about getting rid of them, it's about knowing where they came from. Why did they arise? Why were they created? And am I aware of how they play out in my regular life? And those are really like our learned behaviors. So was I conditioned growing up, growing up as a mixed race person who identifies as black but in a predominantly white community, my bias around my blackness was shaped by my understanding of how white people defined blackness around me. So I even had my own biases about what it meant to be black. And when I had to challenge those as I got older and was in more spaces with more black people, I had to understand that that bias was a product of what I was raised to believe about myself or about people that looked like me. And then thinking about why I was taught that was a product of where they were raised and what they were led to believe in stuff. If you ever come to my office, I have a ton of Life magazines. Life magazines are a great example of how bias on massive scales have shaped our beliefs and our understandings in societies. You look at a Life magazine from 1960s, then a Life magazine in 1980s, and then 1990s, and you look at how things are depicted and shaped and discussed and things, and you'll catch these nuances that I'm like, wow, if this was the main source of information for the massive scales in America in the absence of social media, this becomes the status quo, this becomes the baseline. And so I think the trick here when we think about positionality and being products of our context is understanding what was true in my context at the time that led me to have that belief, and then interrogate that belief. Where did that belief come from? Is there harm in that belief that I still hold? What do I need to do to interrogate that belief, or maybe shape those beliefs? Because our beliefs are really just built on a bunch of data that we collect from our context and from our environments. So before I jump into the next part of that, any questions about kind of what I just offered to the space? Is it resonating with people? Does it feel making sense? Okay. So we're going to do this activity, kind of products of our context. And I have some worksheets that I developed for you all. Oops, sorry. And what you're going to be looking at is a positionality and social identity wheel. For some of you, this may look familiar. For others, it may be new. There's a lot of renditions of how this goes, so I kind of adapted one that I felt was accessible for all of us in the room, no matter where we're entering the conversation at. But as you'll see on the right are identity categories. They're aspects of our identity. They're kind of social identity constructs. It's the way we tend to organize ourselves as humans in groups and these different things, the way we make decisions. In those, you'll see there are the categories on the left, and on the right are three kind of options of what would be a response to one of those categories. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. It is not all the options that are even there, but just for the sake of our exercise together, I wanted to kind of narrow it down. I would love to give you maybe 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes to on your own fill in your wheel. So if you look at, let's say, the skin color empty part of the wheel, and then you go over to the right and it says skin color, white, different shades are dark, to write in your wheel where you see your skin tone at or what that is. Now I'm also going to preface that only write what you feel comfortable in your wheel. Fill out your wheel to the level of comfortability that you feel. I will not be asking you at any point to read through your entire wheel and like go through this, but really another way to start about is what parts of these identities are really important to you, or that you feel really shape who you are or how you move through this world. So I'll give you about 3 minutes, because it shouldn't take too long to do that, and then we'll check back in. Another way to think about these are the lenses in which all the things are filtered through. These are our default kind of filters that we carry. And take about 1 more minute. Awesome. So we're going to kind of revisit this a little bit later, but this is again to just kind of get us thinking about what are all these aspects of our identity? What are these filters that we wear that shape our understanding? What are the things that have been a part of our context that we are a product of and of itself? Anybody want to add anything before I move on to the next part about? Yeah, go for it.
I'm still struggling with neurodiversity.
So when we think about people who are neurodiverse, I think about it in regards to, like as somebody like myself who has ADHD. To me, often, sometimes these neurological things or these I don't want to mess this up necessarily because I'm not like a genius on this, but I see it's a way to think about how you think differently, how you go about making meaning. So for me, I would consider myself not neurotypical. I would consider myself neurodivergent or even neuroatypical. So that's kind of like, that would kind of be like my example. I don't know, does anybody else we're here for each other's learning, so does anybody else have anything, how they made meaning of it or how they made sense of that category?
That was the same as
Yeah,
you.
okay, yeah. I see your mind going a little bit. Director Bendo, I see you think.
I just think of, my brother is on the autism spectrum.
Exactly.
I think about how he's probably be considered significant neurodivergent. And I would be on a different, I won't say opposite, but on a different scale than what
Yeah.
he was, because I'm not considered on the autism spectrum.
Exactly.
So that I would consider myself more neurotypical compared to my brother, but not meaning that he has any diminished capacity or anything.
Exactly.
It's a different way to think.
Yep. And sometimes too, those have sometimes historically been included in just like a disability category or like an ability thing. But when we think about like a physical ability versus actual like neuro ability and things, that's where I see that neuro category coming into, that neurodiversity coming into play.
Also feels like I can get more education in that area as well, so I
Yeah.
can have the right vocabulary. I guess that's where my struggle is. I
Yeah.
want more vocabulary to be
Yeah.
able to talk about that.
Definitely. That help a little bit? Tim? Okay, yeah. Sweet. Okay, so moving on to this idea of intersectionality. So here, is this a new word for a lot of people here? Have we heard it before? Kind of a thing? Okay. So intersectionality acknowledges the complex relationships between social identities and systems of power and oppression. So like I said, I don't just move through the space as a black person or just move through the space as a woman. I move through this space as a black woman. And so when we think about how those are played on in spaces, if they're already in spaces in which women are afforded a level of disprivilege or disempowerment, it's going to be compounded by the fact that I am also a black woman, and given the way that racial privilege and disprivilege plays out in spaces. So there also might be in spaces, though, where I may be, because I'm a black woman, I'm also a black cisgendered woman. So the cisgenderedness of my gender identity provides me privilege in relation to somebody who may be a trans black woman. So understanding the intersections of identity and the ways in which they afford us power and privilege, depending on how they're at play in certain spaces, is important, especially when we're talking about wanting to be in community with others and learn more about other cultures, is understanding where maybe in this other space, I'm traditionally someone who's not afforded power and privilege, but the minute I enter in this other space, I actually might now have a lot of power and privilege compared to what optically may be afforded to me because of other things. It's also, again, acknowledges the fluid and relational and social construction of identities. In the intersectional paradigm, recognizes that every person has multiple and diverse identities, and that when combined in unique ways to shape our perspectives and experiences with oppression and privilege. And again, back to products of our context. So in this context, intersectionality recognizes that oppression does not exist within a vacuum, but rather intersecting oppressions at work are working together to produce different injustices. Here's kind of an image of what that can look like. And so we took that wheel that you saw a little bit, and now it's all blended in relation together. That not a single one of those identities in your wheel is at play in its own. They're all interconnected and woven into each other.
What I noticed is that all of those definitions are definitions by what society decided,
Yeah,
right? So,
true by definition.
right. So it's not like every society decides what they wanna identify with, because I didn't know I was black until I came to the United States.
Yeah, constructs.
I didn't, but the society in the United States told me I'm a black.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I have to operate within the context of the society, how to be black,
Yeah.
right? So that's also something that intersectionality is.
Yeah, intersectionality, I mean, it really plays on these constructs, the
Right.
constructs that we build around these different identities.
Right.
Gender constructs, racial constructs, socioeconomic constructs, just these, and that are essentially, that lead to biases.
Right.
That if you are A, that means B, C, D,
Yeah,
E.
yeah, however that
And
is.
God forbid you're deviating from any of those C, D, E, and Fs.
Right.
And then it allows people to just fill in the blank. Or like, oh, well, if I see A in front of me, then definitely B, C, and D must be true. But that's not how we live. That's not how things exist.
Right.
But when you have systems that are in place that play on affording privilege and power to those different constructs, then you find yourselves in these situations where I'm like, the lived experience is not adding up with what the espoused intention is, and that's where the reconciliation has to happen. That space in between is where that oppression lives and breeds and loves to exist. I know a lot of critical social psychology describes identity as a social construction that is learned through interactions with others in the world. And that has a strong impact on who we become. So to your exact point, Awale, I didn't know I was black until I came here, and I
Yeah,
didn't
I
even
mean-
know what being black was
Right.
until America told me what being black in America
What it means to
was.
be black. And also, like you said, if you're A, you must be B, C, and D.
Yeah.
Right? So those are the other things that I had to learn.
Yep.
Which means, okay, since I'm identified as A, then I have to be B, C,
Mm-hmm.
and D. And how do I make sure that I understand and learn
Yep.
that is how society is going to judge me, and I have to either make sure I overcome that, or make sure that I don't emphasize those stereotypes.
Yep.
And those are the biases that
Yep.
people are. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, go for it, Leslie.
This gets into more of a feeling, but I can feel differently in my intersexuality with familiarity, because I can go into a group that I've known for a long time and knows me, and all those can play differently than I walk into a group or a country. I mean, when I've traveled, people look differently at me. So familiarity, how does that?
Well, I mean, it's relationships. Relationships are important. The more you have deeper relationships with people, you know more parts about their stories. So, and I'm gonna space on her name right now, which I should know her name. She does the TED Talk, but around the stereotype and the danger of a single story. It's not that any stereotype is wrong, it's just that one story becomes the only story. So if your only story of me is based on two aspects of my identity, you've robbed me of this like more intersectional, robust sense of self that I have and that I bring to the space. And so that gets back to relationships, of having relationships to know all the different parts of somebody. A lot of times we make judgments based off of our visible identities. But a lot of these things on this wheel are invisible.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never know how much education somebody has just by looking at them, unless it's at a graduation with a certain cap and gown on to say what level they're at. You'll never know maybe what some language somebody speaks until they open their mouths, what people's, we have all these things that are part of and shape who we are and how we navigate the world that maybe aren't actually visible. And that's another layer of work too, is to think about how these aspects of my identity that a lot of people see first of me impact the actual identities that mean the most to me. So for me, some parts of my identity that are super important is my educational journey, what I went through to get the education I got, or to be able to, I'm not afforded, looked at as a single young black female that I own a house. But that's really important to me. That's a really big, important part of myself, but not something that somebody would just get looking at me or make an assumption that that's something that I have. So that's where all this kind of comes into, that's why the relationship is key, is when you have relationships with people, you spend more space and are spending time, you understand these different parts of who they are or the different parts of who a community is and how they move.
And relationships are important too, but also in different groups and different relationships that we have with people, we still have to be aware of our own privileges and identities that we hold. Because it doesn't mean, because I'm married to a black man, doesn't mean that I understand everything about every black person.
Absolutely.
So it's just like, it's different context, and I don't get a pass in language or anything like that. And I have to always build relationships with different groups of people, no matter who I'm married to or whatnot. And I think that's something for us to kind of think about, is that these don't exist independently. Like, they intersect. Like, a person who grows up in Seattle is gonna have a different experience if they're queer than if they grew up in rural Montana. Like, there's different things that happen.
Or you-
And so
And
then
even if
what,
they're queer in Seattle, if they grew up, what part of Seattle?
exactly, yeah, depending on.
Part of Seattle you grow up in.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so it's just thinking about those kinds of things as well, I think is important as we continue this work, because there's a lot to kind of unpack. So I'm really glad that
Yeah.
we're talking about intersectionality, because that's super important. Because we can paint broad strokes.
Absolutely.
But those are usually stereotypes and things that don't necessarily mean that's the identity that I hold. It's just, it makes it easier if I'm going to talk about what it means to be a queer disabled person. I can paint one broad stroke, but that doesn't mean that everyone identifies
That part.
based on my identity of them.
Yep.
I like when someone says, tell me about yourself and who you are.
Yeah. You get to hear for the first.
Which one do you want to know?
Which?
Yeah.
That is always, because, I'm serious, I mean,
Yeah.
because it's.
Who am I talking to?
Right, I mean, so therefore, it's a, you know, it's a whole myriad. I mean, it takes a lifetime
Yep.
to develop who you are. So in a snippet, automatically, because we always identify with our eyes, you know, race comes to the very first thing someone sees, and then automatically, that is so. And unfortunately, our brain has this thinking of putting things in a very convenient place.
Association.
Right? So automatically, the person I'm talking to associating with me on that. So then I'm always feel like I'm fighting
Yep.
that association.
And it's not about necessarily fighting it, it's just about being very aware of it.
Right.
Being very cognizant of when it's at play. Because sometimes those associations are valid,
Right.
but the trick is not allowing those associations to get extrapolated to a monolith of people. You know, or to impact how you see other people. I think, Leslie, you're in equity council, and one of the things we did when we did introductions is we opened up what's important for all of us to know about you. We asked everybody that, and that looked different for everybody. We gave different prompts about different parts of their identity, their lived experience and stuff, but it's about how do you open it up so people can invite those intersections of themselves in there, and that's where you get to belonging. It's not just diversity. Diversity is really just looking at the wheel as individual things. That inclusion and belonging happens when we start to look at things intersectionally.
If I could also add to Director Farah about the belonging piece and the feeling. When we think of skin color, I thought of students who are also going through those same constructs. Who sometimes they may be in a room and they're not even seen, but yet they're there. And that has to do with belonging, that just the construct and the language being used and the bias that exist in there are what our kids have had to deal with for a long time. And so, anyway, just want to add that for our learning, that sometimes you're right, we're right here, but we're not seen. And students don't even, that's where they don't feel like they belong.
So then what are we doing with our language that we're using with students? What are we doing in our class practices and our relationship building that
Yep.
make us, so all of our students are visible? That's really important.
That is sense of belonging.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thing that.
And so that all parts of them are valued, so that they feel valued, they feel like they matter, they feel like they have something they can contribute, that people feel like that there is space for them to be their full, authentic self in those places.
Yeah, I would also, great point, Director Beno, that what are we doing that is not creating belonging, that we're not even aware of?
Yeah.
And those are those biases that are more harmful, that when we don't, it's not
Don't even know.
intentional.
Yeah, no, it's not.
But it's happening in our kids, unless we create that relationship to really learn how they were harmed and what did it, we learn more,
Right.
so.
And what's interesting too is belonging is one of those, because it's a feeling,
Right.
it's an individual feeling, you know, we're quick to be like, well, what's the definition of it?
Right.
You know, or we're talking about it in schools and it's like, we want to measure sense of belonging, or, you know, belonging this, and the first question I always get is, well, how are we defining belonging?
Right.
And I'm like, well, it's an individual thing. And so when I've ran circles with young people before, or even adults, I'm asking like, tell me about a time when you felt like you belonged. Everybody can figure out that time. They all know what it is. I don't have to define belonging when I ask that question. And then I ask, what about that made you feel like you belonged? And you start to piece out the characteristics, the factors, the things, the behaviors that were present in that space that they felt the most like they belonged. And that's where the work lives. It's like, so how do we grab onto these things that are so deeply resonating with them that they can remember that made them feel like they belong, and try and replicate those same behaviors and practices in spaces. And for some people, feeling like belonging is just being asked questions. For others, it's being able to have a space where they're just acknowledged every day. For others, it's enough space for them to try something they've never tried. The gamut becomes open. And so when I think about belonging as one of those things that has a working definition, it's fluid. It changes depending on contexts and communities and cultures that we're in about how we define belonging in those spaces. So yeah, I want to kind of keep us moving because we're gonna dive into more deep, obviously, conversation a little bit later. But for this, there's a couple things I want to get to. But I love it. So this next idea is around intersectionality. Can I take a volunteer to read the quote for me, please, by Dr. Lee Kimberly Crenshaw? Go for it, yeah. Nose goes. Okay, yeah.
Go. Okay. Okay, this is pretty small print.
I know, sorry. You can look on the screen.
No, I can read it.
Okay.
Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privileges, and that apparently comes from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yep. So I'm going to play just a quick video by her, too, that kind of sums all that up and kind of a little bit of a background on it. It's only about a minute. Play for me. There we go.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
I love it. Just quick, even less than 2 minutes, to the point, summing up kind of what we talked about. But again, really, I think the trick there too is that understanding of how things play out now, the historical through line for what has led to that, and then how it still happens, but where the interruptions need to happen. And I think when we're doing our work as a district, whether it's on our district teams or up here when you're thinking about policy and all of that stuff, it's thinking about the intersections of those things and not these individually, but what are the things that maybe are at play to help us make sure we're asking the right questions. Okay, and so then again, just kind of like building on this some more, oh, they better not do this to me. Examining the positionality given by intersections. So I think it's really important to know that social privilege exists on the basis of complex and intersecting social identities, such as race, gender, ability, class, faith, religion, age, and sexuality, and the relative distance these identities are to dominant power and dominant identities. And so we're not going to have time today to go into what that dominant and identities and dominant power is, but that's going to be saved for some of our work in the future together. But first, understanding who we are, and then we'll look at it in context to that. But to give you kind of an idea of how, oh my goodness, my YouTube rules, I literally just watched these here. Immediately sad. Let me just do this real quick. What did KSD do to me literally in the last, like, well, luckily I know these by heart, so we can just look them up. All these are not.
Weird.
Their connection?
I was just trying to be the fun police. Oh, okay.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Oh.
Nope.
Gone.
Hey, they're really good too. I really want you to see them.
Let me see if we can do it. Is it okay if I do it in a different browser?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry about that.
No, you're okay. I tested it
Ooh, maybe something wrong with Chrome. That's not me.
from the time I played it.
Try typing it in.
Yeah. Oh, no.
We can sense some homework coming on.
Yep.
Yeah, that one right there.
Please excuse us with minor technical difficulties there.
Yes.
I could do a tap dance.
Right.
Joe could sing.
Yeah, let me see.
Did you miss the Christmas concert?
Kim could do, I don't know what Kim, and what a Wally
I
could
know,
do.
I know. It's gonna be funny. You don't expect me to have any, like, tuning or anything to do with music.
Really?
I have no rhythm whatsoever.
Really?
Zero.
That surprises me.
Yeah, ask Israel, he'll tell you.
Switch it.
I think we have it on camera.
Right here? Okay.
To this.
Sweet.
Sweet.
And then I can help you switch back when you're done.
Okay, sweet. Maybe it'll play just through this.
You might have to go through your speakers. I don't know if this is.
Media center.
Or is it over here?
I switched to my library.
Okay.
Race and.
Can you guys hear that? Okay.
Race and disability, race and class. Intersectionality is something that I think about every day because I'm living it. And I also think about what it means to show up in the world in my specific body with my specific experience and background. I am African American. I'm also straight. I am able-bodied except for the fact that I was born with a visual impairment, so I walk around with a disability that sometimes people can't see. I was raised in an upper middle class background, so I have class privilege. All of those things play into power, privilege, and marginalization that I experience depending on those different aspects of my identity. even though race is a social construct and we know that genetically there is no such thing as race, it's this very powerful, powerful illusion that's been perpetuated and used to kill people. It's been used to justify war. It's been used to enslave people. It's been used to force people into indentured servitude. And to disregard that history is disrespectful to all the people who suffered and fought for me to be able to live closer to freedom today. When I am in feminist spaces and sometimes I might be told that it's divisive for me to bring up race, that we need to focus on the issue at hand, which is gender. Or it might come up in a space where we're doing racial justice work and I might be told by another person of color, well, this isn't an issue about your gender, this isn't an issue about race, and it doesn't matter what gender issue is, race has to take priority and precedence in this issue. That's impossible for me to make a prioritization of various parts of my identity that are equally integral to who I am and that are inextricably connected. We want to make sure that we're not single-storying other people and that we aren't contributing to that, that people need to be able to show up as their whole selves, and that's better for us as a community and as a culture and a society. What I really want to ask people who ask me that question is, what part of your own internalized depression or your own addiction to the drug that is privilege makes you fear full liberation for all people? There's a problem with even seeing this as divisive. There's a problem when we're not actually understanding that the liberation of all people makes us all free. When trans women of color are free, that's bringing me close to freedom. When Syrian refugees are free, that brings me close to freedom. It's really important for us to think about that, not to think about how we protect our own privilege with a structure that doesn't even work for us, but how do we create more openness and liberation for all human beings, for all humanity.
That's Jamila. I'm going to show you two other people. Because again, intersections play differently.
Sonia Dinasaka, migrant queer poet, cultural organizer. Race and gender, race and immigration status, race and sexuality. Everything and every way that I'm negotiating my space and the way that I'm accessing space is in relation to how the United States of America is seeing me as this brown woman, as this foreign, as this migrant, as this person with an accent, as this person who's perceived femme or woman. I can come up here and identify as a white woman, but that is not the reality. In migrant spaces, we're fighting for immigration rights, getting that DREAM Act or getting that, CIR. Don't talk about, your reproductive rights, or don't talk about your queerness. Doesn't even take into consideration economic class. Doesn't take into consideration how very English-centered it is. How are we fighting for immigration rights and most of your pathways are in English? That doesn't make sense. There's been the neglect to acknowledge immigration or even undocumented statuses. And then in a general sense, my identity and as an artist and a poet, that is always erased in many spaces. You're always doing reactionary work, and you're always doing, fighting against this or fighting against something. But when it comes to artists, we are always left behind. That's one of the reasons many of us burn out, because there's no recognizing of all of our identities and showing up as whole beings and showing up as complicated individuals. In this country, what I've noticed is immigration reform has always been about the access to whiteness. Example, we have two borders. Which border is racialized? Which border is more militarized? Which border exists within racial coded language? That's usually the Mexican border, right? And there's this myth of that there's a border right with Canada. Many movements that are advocating for undocumented communities, they're always leaving out Black migrants. Look at all the campaigns, look at even the posters. There's one sort of depiction of immigration and migrants that is very coded under who is now deemed acceptable to kind of uplift white supremacy or whiteness or a certain identity of citizenship in this country. So, and that's many brown communities. There's the reason why there's anti-Blackness within migrant spaces and non-Black people of color spaces. There's always going to be a policy that is going shifted. But at the core of it, non-white bodies are always going to be seen as quote unquote illegal, or as not having any legality in this country. All of my identities are intertwined. I think that having to negotiate with any of them is not gonna take us anywhere to the journey of liberation or radicalness or progressiveness that we are actually trying to do. If anything, is the erasure of what has led us here.
And then one more we'll hear from Sunny.
My name is Sunny Singh. I'm a musician and social justice educator. Race and religion. We all have multiple identities, and those multiple identities are intersecting to affect our experience, to affect the way that we walk through the world. I am South Asian. I also consider myself Punjabi. I am Sikh, as in S-I-K-H, the faith. I am a cisgender man. I am straight, and I grew up middle class. I am able-bodied. Structural racism, structural religious oppression or Christian hegemony, structural patriarchy or sexism, all of these things are actually interlocked in society. Intersectionality means that we acknowledge that we actually all have to fight against all forms of oppression if we actually truly want to get free. I can't think about my racial identity as a brown person or as a South Asian American without also experiencing sort of the racialized aspects of being a Sikh, right? Being someone who wears a turban, who has a beard, those are very racialized things, even though for me, they have to do with my religion. I haven't been able to walk through this world or to walk through this country as a brown-skinned, turban-wearing, beard-having man without that being just very apparent in the stares that I get, in the derogatory comments, the terrorists, the Osamas, the ISIS. My religion, Sikhism, has sort of been compounded with this vilification of Muslims and Muslim-looking people at large. You know, that might be sort of technically religious oppression, for example, or it might be tied to Islamophobia. But those things are deeply tied to racism and white supremacy more broadly. My race, my gender, my religion might very well have consequences on whether I make it walking down the street alive. That's the reality that we're living in. So to not talk about them, to not confront those things very directly, to me is really the divisive thing, right? That's allowing these divisions and allowing these hierarchies and allowing these injustices to continue perpetuating themselves. If we don't stand up against them, if we don't amplify our voices against these things, they're going to continue on whether we like it or not. What's been harder is thinking about my intersectional self along the lines of the ways I experience privilege, right? So my cisgender maleness, right? My heterosexuality, the class privilege I had growing up, those things have always been much harder to look at. If we have sort of a choice whether to implore one or more of our identities, it probably means that we have a relative amount of privilege. If we really want to be intersectional, we really have to challenge ourselves to also implore the ways in which we experience privilege and the ways that we can be in solidarity with folks that don't have as much privilege.
Thank you, Sunny. A bunch more of those videos too. I encourage you to watch. There's a lot of people that you can that share their experience, that speak to those things. But I think really at the core of it is that we're complex individuals. We carry that complexity with us, and with those complexities, there's a lot of history and deep-seated beliefs and systems and things invested in parts of our identity, giving privilege and some of parts and proximity to power, and others that are not. And that's important for us to be mindful of, especially when we go into communities. I just like Sunny noted, as a person of color, you know, sitting sometimes and having to reckon with privilege that I have in different spaces, or when I'm setting expectations, or I have these internal expectations of what young girls who look like me should be doing at their age, or what they should be capable of doing. I have to really check that sometimes and recognize I don't know what their living situation is. I don't know what their socioeconomic status is. I don't know a lot of these things on this wheel. But if I take the time to be into community with them, and I take the time to listen and to understand what are the parts of her identity or their their experience that's important, that's most impacting them, then there are ways that I can use my power and privilege to help remove some of those barriers so that we do move more towards a space of ultimately belonging for people of their full selves. The next part of this exercise that I'll give you, because I'm like literally just a little over time, so I'm gonna have you have this for your review, and this is the next part of that chart that I handed you. And this is the overlay. So you have your wheel that you figured out, and then this next thing is the wheel of power and privilege. And so depending on what you filled in your boxes, you'll see that some parts of where you stand afford you greater power and privilege, the more they are closer to the center, and the more you are on the outside of the margins is where you experience disempowerment, disprivilege, or marginalization. And so things to think about. And again, this is not an exhaustive wheel. These aren't exhaustive categories of all your identities, but it does put into perspective about when we are in spaces or we have access and the ability to do things, where are parts of my identity affording me proximity to power? And that power and that inner layer circle on that sheet I just gave you is really dominant culture. So that's kind of a peek into what some of our work later together will be around, is looking at into dominant culture and really understanding where are our systems, our policies, and the work that we're always doing here in the district is where are we making sure that dominant culture is not at play in a way that's exclusionary to the diverse and uniqueness and complexities of the people in our district. So with that, I know I'm over time, so I'm gonna pause there. And that's all I have for you for our time together today, but we're gonna be doing some more really great work in the future together that goes a little bit deeper into this stuff and how do we take this and move it forward. And just a little tidbit on privilege, I was talking with a teacher and just trying to understand how to explain it to a group of third graders around understanding privilege. And one of the things I offered to her was she was concerned that kids were believing that one was better than the other. Or somebody's better, if I have privilege here, it's because I'm better than this or that. And I told her, think about it, before starting with race, think about left hand, right hand. So like, right-handed people have a huge amount of privilege in this world. Yeah. Everything is set up for right-handed, right-dominant people. Our scissors, the way we drive in the car, the desks that we have, all that stuff. And left-handed people have to consistently look for accommodations that they have to do on their own to have that same experience. So I'm not a better person because I'm right-handed, but I have the privilege of not having to think about extra things to make the space work for me. I know that I can go to the thrift store, most likely or not, the glove that's in the sports section is gonna work for me on my right hand. I know that if I reach into a thing of scissors, growing up, they're gonna work for my right hand. But that's not afforded, that privilege is not afforded to people who are left-handed. So when we think about privilege, it's not necessarily about one being better than the other. It's about how much is the resting state, the dominant state, in alignment with your lived experience. And when we look at the different identifiers, that's where you can start to see where things are in alignment with that or not. So that's what I have for you guys today in our time together.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, Simone.
We should
Yeah.
have more of this.
Yeah,
will.
there's a lot more.
Just the beginning.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
to
look
be
forward.
continued. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Totally.
Okay, we're now agenda 2.02, legal review with Mr. Paul Provogo. Superintendent Belak, would you do the introduction?
Absolutely. Thank you, Vice President Farah. I'd like to introduce our General Counsel, Mr. Paul Brockvogel, who will introduce our guest for tonight. And just for the board, I wanted to kind of give you some context that recall at our previous retreat, we had a full day set and we needed to move the date, and there were some agenda items that needed to be moved. So the next couple of hours really are that second half of our retreat that we had planned. And so apologize for the length of that, but Mr. Brockvogel, we'll get it started.
Chair Farah, Superintendent Vela, and the rest of the board. It's great to be with you tonight. I want to introduce a friend of mine, Steve DiGiulio, and he's with the firm Foster Garvey. He's been practicing, I looked it up, so it's true. It's on the Washington State Bar Association website. Admitted in 1976, and since then he's been a friend to municipal governments for a long time. He's represented utilities and represented clients in political matters, school districts, of course. and has really been a friend to all the practitioners in the area. And he's going to talk to you tonight about some do's and don'ts and personal exposure that you may run into, personal liability, in relation to your board work. It's something we've been sort of scratching around the edges on since I got here. But I think Steve will do a really good job in answering questions. He brings a wealth of knowledge and, again, 47 years of background. So with that, I'll leave it to Steve to present, and we'll have opportunities to go through and questions. And after Steve, we're going to have Chris Lawrence from Propel Insurance, who's standing by. And Chris is going to talk about D&O coverage, and you'll see how that fits in with Steve's presentation.
Members of the board, Mr. Superintendent, thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Those are nice professional background, but I suspect if I'm going to talk to you about ethics and law and kind of following the line, you probably should know a little bit more about me. My dad was born in Black Diamond to the son of immigrants working in the coal mines. And I put my way through school working as a Teamster for about 10, 11 years. Still hold my honorary withdrawal card from Teamsters 174, one of the most prominent local unions in the nation. And as Paul indicated, I've been representing local government pretty much my entire career. I served as Kent City Attorney and Kent City Administrator, lived in Kent for 21 years. Our 4 children went to Scenic Hill Elementary and KJH. So it is good to be back in this community that I have loved since I became city attorney in Kent. So if I am following this correctly, I've got my clicker here. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Board member roles and duties, public comments and community engagement, and the legal exposure, government and personal liability. And as Paul indicated, that will transition into some of the issues involving insurance. And I'll talk about also a particular recommendation that I discovered in preparing for this presentation. So, first, board members' roles and duties. This is one that I like to start with because it is very interesting, particularly with newly elected officials, this well-worn expression about you can please some of the people all of the time, you can please all of the people some of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. And in your role as a school board member, you certainly recognize that. Your duties are extensive, but the first and foremost one that we emphasize is the fiduciary duty that you hold as an elected official with the school board. You hold a public trust. And that role, as we'll talk about in greater detail, is the predominant role over all others. And we'll talk about some examples as we go forward. Those ethical duties are expressed in state law as well as your own protocols. Chapter 23A, that's a mistypo there, 330-100 is, of course, the reference to your authority as a school board member under the common school provisions of state law. You've got contractual duties with respect to the superintendent. But one area that you may not recognize, because when you are adopting bond measures and other contracts, you don't recognize necessarily that coming with those approvals is all of the other aspects of the legal relationship created by those contracts. When the school district sells bonds to the market, when people buy your bonds, you are promising them, the bondholders, that the school district is responsible for those obligations, and you make specific covenants to the bondholders in those agreements. The bond. You've got the government and generally accepted accounting principles and your own financial policies that are in many respects directed by state law, what we commonly refer to as the Accountancy Act, that is administered by the state auditor. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in one of our slides. As an elected official, you've got the burdens of having to deal with the doctrine of incompatible public offices, as well as potential conflicts that arise through the OPMA. And then when you're sitting on personnel matters, if you do have to deal with the duty of impartiality, fairness, and the appearance of fairness. And we'll talk about some of those as well. Started out by talking about the fiduciary duty as an elected official. And it doesn't matter whether you're a city council member or a fire district commissioner, a port commissioner, or a school board member. You hold a fiduciary responsibility to the school district. And our Supreme Court over a century ago talked about that in a case involving the town of Northport. It doesn't exist any longer, but it did then. Let me give you a practical example of what that means. If Mr. Brockvogel was a private practitioner and worked part-time for the school district, as many school district lawyers do in smaller districts without full-time counsel, and he had a client that had a piece of property, and he, as the school district lawyer, learned that the school district was considering acquiring that property for a new school site. He has two competing trust fiduciary obligations. His trust and fiduciary obligation to his client, and his trust and fiduciary responsibility to the school district. Which one wins? The school district responsibility. If I'm a physician and sit on the school board, and I know that the school is considering something that might be detrimental to one of my patients, who knows what it might be, increasing the use of an athletic facility that may cause more noise to disturb the sensitive concerns of this particular patient. Doctor can't deal with that patient on those issues because the doctor's principal responsibility is to the school district. And that's what this means, the fiduciary responsibility, the primary duty. And when there's a conflict, everything goes away except for your responsibility to the district. We'll talk about some more examples of this as we go forward. And I'm reminding all of us that it is not unusual for this to arise, not only in school districts but others. In Washington state, there's 57 types of local government, from the larger governments that you well know, cities and counties, school districts obviously, down to mosquito control districts and noxious weed control districts. So the rules that we're talking about apply to all 57 of these types of local governments. The other aspect, and just a very quick delve back into history, When Washington became a state in 1889, and the teachers of history certainly recognize this, the United States was in the progressive era of this United States history. Post-Civil War, post-scandal, lots of corruption, the railroads throwing money at towns to gain footholds. This progressive era, the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, was marked by substantial concerns about better forms and better ethical government. And so Washington became a state at that time, and we have in our Constitution and in our laws that date back to early times these very strict rules regarding the conduct of elected officials as well as other public officials. So that's just a little historic note for your consideration. This happened to be an interesting slide that I put together. I ran across the copy of the Telegraph advising that when the Congress had approved statehood and the president had signed it. You certainly recognize that, there's the slide there. You recognize that this school district is a larger one, and so you are a first-class school district under our state statutes. The highest designation, obviously. And in a school district, you have the legislative authority, that's you, the board. You have the superintendent, who is your contract executive, as well as you have the others who need to assist you, such as your district or special counsel. So turning back to the fiduciary duty point again in those roles, you have that duty to serve the public that elected you, to act in the best interest of the school district. Putting aside your other interests, the school district is the principal interest. Remember, you are a municipal corporation. We don't like to think of ourselves as corporate entities, but you are a corporate entity and you service the board of that corporation. And so just like a board member of a corporation, you have a fiduciary duty to that corporation. You have a fiduciary duty to the corporation that is the Kent School District. And as part of that, you are balancing constantly your political posture as an elected official with those duties and responsibilities to the district. We recognize that you don't give up your political life when you become an elected official. But that political life, as we'll talk about further, is substantially limited except when you're in campaign territory on your own behalf. And you will find that in many cases your personal or special interests, such as the interests of a doctor or a lawyer or a minister, may have to give when it comes to the interests that might clash with those of the school district, because the school district comes first. The board acts by a majority. No individual has district authority, but individual board members may expose the district to liability and expose yourself as well, individually, to liability. Again, kind of thinking ahead to the directors and officers coverage discussion later on in this program. Here are just a few examples. In the case of our Warden School District in the state, our Public Employment Relations Commission found that the conduct of an individual school board member gave rise to an unfair labor practice. That evidence gave rise to an unfair labor practice finding against the Warden School District. Hostile work environment claim, laws against discrimination. The individual conduct of an elected official can give rise to claims of hostile work environment. You can be, in fact, as a person at the top of the organizational chain, your conduct in engaging in wrongful conduct, harassing another employee, or even potentially harassing a vendor for the school district can result in liability to you and to the district. And as we'll talk in greater detail, you have potential personal exposures through the campaign finance and other campaign laws through the Public Disclosure Commission. So that comes to the point that I hinted about with regard to how the district should be thinking broader about protecting itself. State statute specifically provides that local governments can provide indemnification to its officers and employees. And when I do these lectures for organizations, and particularly with the newly elected officials, and I suspect that Board Member Clark may have heard this presentation years past when he was a newly elected Kent City Council member, one of the things I remind those newly elected officials to do is ask to see the city's indemnification policy. And I say, go back to your home city when you're done with this program, Monday morning, call the city clerk and ask for a copy of the city's indemnification policy. You don't get paid a lot for what you do. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So you should be sure that to the extent that you are doing the school district's work, that you are protected. And to emphasize this point, I want to make sure that you know that the process and procedures for this indemnification should be provided by resolution. So when Paul Brockvogel asked me to prepare this program, I said, well, send me a copy of the district's indemnification resolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not
Hey,
surprised.
you know.
Yep.
So I certainly would encourage the district to put that high on your priority list. It's for the protection of not only you, but it's also for the protection of the district. Additionally, there is specific provision in state law that provides for the district, the public corporation, to provide for coverage in the event of a recall petition. This law was adopted as a result of an issue in Enumclaw. I try to bring the South King County elements of this as much as I can. When a very popular mayor was subject to an harassing recall effort and spent a great deal of legal fees in defense against the recall effort, when he was successful, had barbecues and bake sales, friends and neighbors, in order to raise funds to pay off the attorney's fees obligation. And that prompted the legislature then to provide for the government's coverage of expenses in defending against a sufficiency determination. And we know that those are becoming more and more common. One of the most recent ones you've heard about involved the Richland School District, where 3 of the board members were subject to recall for refusing to accept the governor's mask mandates. And the Supreme Court ruled just a little over a month ago on February 9th, well, actually now 2 months ago, that that recall petition could go forward. Now, that recall petition was not only based on the board members' vote to oppose and to preclude the mask mandate, but also there are OPMA, Open Public Meetings Act violations in conjunction with that as well. Where will that go? We're not sure, but the Supreme Court did say there were sufficient grounds for the petition to go forward. For a recall petition to be accepted by the courts, it must meet two tests: factual sufficiency and legal sufficiency. First, with respect to facts, they must show under oath the legal issue of misfeasance, malfeasance, or violation of the oath of office. Somebody just cannot show up and say, I accuse board member X of conduct. They have to have facts to support it, and those facts must demonstrate that the conduct would constitute misfeasance, malfeasance, or a violation of the oath of office. Misfeasance, malfeasance, violating a legitimate order of the governor. Oath of office, you've sworn to uphold the laws of the state of Washington to act in the best interest of the school district. Those could be potential recallable offenses. It is important to recognize that the exercise of judgment and discretion are not valid grounds for recall. You may recall when California Governor Gray Davis was recalled and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected in his place. That doesn't work in Washington State. You can't recall anybody just for the heck of it, as you can in California. In Washington State, you have to meet the standards that are shown here. Factual sufficiency showing a legal foundation that then would allow the petition to circulate for signatures and then to be placed on the ballot if enough signatures are gathered.
Can I ask a question real quick about the last slide? Is that automatic, or does it have to be voted on, or how does that?
It has to be voted on, and that's why you would put that in your policy that's called out here.
So, okay, so even though it says it authorizes it, the board can technically say, never mind, but does that go against that, though, or?
It depends on what the policy says.
Got it.
Yeah, we have had cases in which the policy delegates that to the city manager or to the superintendent, and then that's decided in conjunction with legal counsel. But certainly the board can make that a board decision when it considers that policy. It's a more difficult situation because then you bring politics into the vote. It's not part of this slide presentation, but I will say that voting on the defense of a recall petition against you, an individual board member, is not a conflict of interest. So if you're subject to recall and the question comes up as to whether or not the district will provide legal defense for that petition, initial petition, you can vote on that. Our Supreme Court has already decided that issue. Don't hesitate to ask questions along the way, please. Obviously, if I'm not making myself clear, then others might be confused as well, so please do not hesitate. You can obviously lose office other than by recall. You can forfeit office, and there's a number of ways to do that. In the state of Washington, if you're convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, you are immediately disqualified from holding office, lose your position. And there are other standards as well. This is highly unusual in the state of Washington. If you move out of the district, for example, is another example that occurs from time to time.
Sir,
Yes.
an incident in Kansas City Council, a person was convicted of a crime, And he didn't have to step down from his position.
It depends on what the crime is. If it was something like DWI or,
Well, when he had to show up for prison, he had to drop out.
oh, yeah, if it is,
But he didn't step down until he had to show up for time.
yeah, until you're actually convicted. Technically, as soon as he was convicted and the appeal period was over, therefore incarceration, then the office is forfeited. So
the
I can't
appeal-
tell you about that
appeal time
specific
probably-
case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but as soon as that person is finally convicted, it's done. They can no longer hold office.
That makes sense, yep.
I'll mention another case we had, staying in the South End. We had a case in Pacific, or was it Algona? It was in Algona, in which Civil Service Commissioner was also a minister, and the mayor fired the police chief. The police chief appealed to the Civil Service Commission, and the minister, who was a commissioner, would not resign, notwithstanding his very close relationship with the police chief, despite the counsel that we provided. And as a result, we stayed the proceedings, and they went to court, and the court ordered the commissioner removed, and the hearing then went forward without the commissioner. Another example of those, that fiduciary duty issue that comes up, the forfeiture of office. And I'll just make a note on resignation. Got to be careful about fits of pick or anger, because in a case involving a Paulsbo City Council member who got upset at her council meeting, she got up and said, "I quit," and walked off. And then the next day apparently decided that she really didn't mean it, and said, "Well, you didn't accept my resignation, and I didn't put it in writing, and therefore I still hold the office." And the court said, "Nope, you were done as soon as you announced you were done." So that was a city case. We don't know what would happen in another jurisdiction, but be careful, or you act on anger. I think that's the lesson there. We talked about incompatible offices. The doctrine applies to incompatible public offices. So, could you hold the position of a school board member as well as another position of office with the school board, or with the school district, excuse me? And the answer is no, you could not, unless the state otherwise allows. The most common example we find in this area is when a volunteer firefighter seeks to run for office in that city or in a fire district. And that is an incompatible office, because a firefighter is a public officer, cannot be two officers in the same entity. You also run into this situation when you have questions about whether or not a Kent City Council member could also serve on the Kent School Board, for example. Those become very nuanced issues. My reaction would be no, because the City of Kent and the Kent School District do so many things together. However, here's another example. A state senator, Tim Sheldon, who was also a Mason County commissioner, that was found not to be an incompatible public office, interestingly. So these are not easy issues, but one to be attentive to. When we talk about other incompatibility, not an incompatible public office, we come back to the fiduciary responsibility, because you may find, and we'll talk about this when we get to the Open Public Meetings Act particularly, you may find that you have a position or a job that puts you in a position that's incompatible with your work as a school board member. And again, remembering that the school board is your principal trust, your fiduciary obligation, that's where you first look to your responsibility. We talked about delegation in reference to indemnification. Just a very quick reference, and we'll look across the valley to Des Moines for this situation. The Pete's Towing had long been a business in South King County, and Pete got elected to the Burien City Council. It happened to be the case that Des Moines, not Burien, Des Moines City Council, and he had all of the towing work out of the city of Des Moines. And the number of people who were opposed to Gary Peterson, Pete, of Pete's Towing, brought an action against him and the district for these contracts. And the court said, no, this is not a violation of our ethics code because there's no contract between the city of Des Moines and Pete's Towing. It's simply that that's to whom the folks call, and it's not required, it's not contractual. They could call other towing companies as well. The fact that he got all the towing companies because he's part of the community did not give rise to a conflict of interest. That's and the other point they made was the city council, or in your case, the school board, doesn't make those decisions. Those are decisions that are made by the superintendent, and those are not issues that give rise to conflicts of interest. And as we noted earlier, the superintendent, as chief executive officer of the school district, has those executive authorities. He does the day-to-day stuff at your direction. And it's his responsibility to carry out the responsibilities that you provide to him. Nice that you have a little bit more stability here. I was served for a number of years as general counsel, outside general counsel for the Tukwila School District during a lot of turmoil and the turnover of the superintendents in that district. It's very disconcerting and tough for a community to deal with that. Civility in the conduct of the people's business. And we all know, as we turn to this part of the program, that this is becoming more and more prevalent. You know why. You're dealing with it on a weekly, if not daily basis with the mis and disinformation and social media. And I will comment, having been doing this for some time, that as an elected official, you are in some respects operating with one arm tied behind your back. And you don't have the same resources available to you to counter the slings and arrows that may be thrown at you by those who are opposed to your position or are using social media to attack you. Talked about the exposure that you have in terms of the state auditor. Here's a situation that occurred just at the end of last year involving the Toppenish School District, where the auditor came in and took some serious shots at what it asserted to be the Toppenish School District's lack of attention to its contracts and its programs. You can look that up on the state auditor's website, but it's an example where they did not govern effectively. This is primarily the superintendent's responsibility, but the board of directors, school board of the Toppenish School District, were found not to have ensured that the superintendent's pay and benefits were properly handled in accordance with the written contract. And as you know, school districts have written contracts with their superintendents. So you've got the public looking at you, you've got the state auditor looking at you, you have lots of folks looking at you, all the more reason to be sure that when you are facing these kinds of issues, you fall back to that safe place that is your chief responsibility, and that is to the school district. Spend a few minutes on public meetings and public comment, obviously a source for potential problems with civility and the conduct of government in our state. The people insist that they be informed so that they can retain control over the instruments that they have created. This is language directly out of the Open Public Meetings Act. It is when you see cases that arise under the Open Public Meetings Act or the Public Records Act, you often see the court stating this right up front, reminding us about the fundamental policy that is expressed in the legislatively adopted OPMA and the initiative adopted Public Records Act. They're differently adopted statutes that form the leg of our government greenhouse that we have in this state. And not to spend much time on this, but obviously you've learned through your service that the Open Public Meetings Act applies even to simple discussions. So if three of you are discussing an issue, it's an Open Public Meetings Act issue if you are exposed, even if you're not in a meeting. Telephone calls, a serial call, a chain of calls, email chains can give rise to a violation. In fact, this was first announced by our courts in a case involving a school district in Southwest Washington, where the court looked at serial discussions about school board members communicating with one another about the potential termination of the superintendent. Termination, maybe non-renewal of the contract. I think it was a non-renewal situation, and the court found that was a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. That's why in many of your communications with your administration, you say, please do not respond all, because providing information to you, the superintendent, the district can provide you with information to all of you at the same time, just as they do with your agendas, but do not respond all and discuss those issues outside of the public meeting. These cases are ever present. I mean, just again, all we do is look back to the Richland School Board situation our Supreme Court visited 2 months ago. And you see that these issues continue to abound.
Excuse me, can you go a little bit example on, go back to the serial meetings such as phone tree. What does that mean, phone tree? Like, for example, phone tree is if I have the number, call someone, and then I connected some other board member.
Board member A
Okay.
calls board member B.
Okay.
What do you think about this issue?
Okay.
How are you going to vote on it?
Okay.
B tells A that I'm going to vote yes. Then B calls board member C, and board member C tells board member B that I'm going to vote yes on it. Then board member B or C goes back to board member A and say, we have 3 votes for this issue. Oop. Start hitting buttons too quickly. excuse me. Okay, so that's a serial or a tree of communications, and by having that series of communications among a majority of the school board, you violated the Open Public Meetings Act. So there wasn't a joint discussion, but by those series of emails or telephone calls, the three board members came to a decision, or at least had a discussion outside of the Open Public Meetings Act boundaries. And there's only, two kinds of open public meetings that you're allowed: regular meetings or special meetings. Now, this is not a regular meeting, but it is held under the special meeting requirements: notice, publication of agenda, specific items identified. So again, if you're going to talk about school business with a majority of your members, you have to do it in an open public meeting. That does not mean that this entire school board can't go to a Kent Chamber of Commerce event or a Rotary or a Kiwanis event, even sitting at the same table. But you just can't talk about Kent School District business while you're together. And that's been subject to a number of different discussions in Attorney General's opinion and otherwise. Okay, any further questions on that? Another point we emphasize, and this, it comes back to the fiduciary responsibility issue. This is somewhat common sense, but nevertheless, the Attorney General in a 2017 opinion answered the question about what the legal obligations on an elected official regarding information learned in executive session. And it is a legal obligation, even, if you want to look at it this way, even beyond your fiduciary duty, to not disclose information discussed in a properly convened executive session. That disclosure would violate state law, the Code of Ethics of Municipal Officers. It could constitute a misdemeanor under 42-2100, official misconduct under the criminal laws 9A 80010, and it would also be a potential violation of the attorney-client privilege if it was attorney-client related. So this is a serious issue. We'll talk about it. It's in state statute, and the Attorney General specifically addressed it in this particular opinion. I don't know how often it happens now, but it certainly happened regularly before. I was associated with a city where a city council member would go from an executive session and go across the street and start having drinks with the representatives of the union representing the city employees and tell them what the city's negotiating parameters were. And Tim, that was before your time at Kent. And the law was specifically designed to prohibit that kind of conduct. So there are teeth in that standard. Now, the free speech rights that you have as an elected official aren't absolute. Here's a case out of Washington where a school board, the Bethel School Board, took action against one of its members who had been substantially criticizing the superintendent, and the remainder of the school board said, well, you may be critical of the superintendent, but that doesn't mean that you have a right to hold a position as vice president of the school board, and so removed him from his position of vice president of the school board. He sued, and the court said, you don't have any First Amendment rights in that regard, and the school board was well within its rights to act based upon those issues. And our United States Supreme Court made that basic same decision in 2022 in a case involving the board of the Houston Community College system, when a board member challenged the removal from a appointment, and our Supreme Court said, if anything, censures of an elected representative's speech have proven more common yet at the state and local level. Censure is the really only tool that you have with respect to one of your own members. You don't have the authority to remove another school board member. You don't have the authority to recall. That's not your right. That's the public's right. And so censure is a very common tool used if a member is seen to be acting acting contrary to the rules of the board or the policies of the board. I like to throw this slide in, reminding us that we understand that in politics there can be differences in opinion, but as Ronald Reagan said taking after Bernard Meltzer's comment, you can disagree without being disagreeable. So I'll just leave you with that suggestion. Turning to public employees and the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law, and when we say Congress, same applies to state government and to local government as well, with respect to limiting the authority of public speech. We'll come back to questions as we get into this program element, the public comment and community engagement program. But again, ask questions as you come along the way. Your meetings, your meeting tonight, your meetings, are the meetings of the elected board of the school district, not the meetings for the public. Public has a right to be at your meetings in most cases, but they're not the public's meetings, they're the school board's meetings. You have, arguably the public has no greater right to show up and be heard on the floor of our state legislature or the United States Congress than they do to show up and speak at your school board meetings. But you are the form of government closest to the people, where the people expect to be able to be heard. And that's why you permit public comment on a regular and routine basis. This happens to be one form of policy that many cities follow, local governments follow. This happens to be from the Bothell City Council protocol manual that has been adopted by many, basically having public comment period, and that public comment period regulated 3 minutes. You can't give your time to others, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a standard program. I think you have such a policy in place here. And while it is your meeting and you can control it, you see what happens if you try to prevent public comment at a school board meeting. Seattle School Board tried this. Some of you will remember the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. This was an article, front page of the Seattle PI when it was still being published. And school board in Seattle quickly backed off that position. Again, the opportunity to speak is considered so important, and particularly at the local level, that you're going to provide for that, although regulated. When we talk about the use of school district facilities, we have to be careful. Our state constitution and laws limit the use of public facilities for private purposes, and that extends to political issues as well. With three narrow exceptions, the public facilities may not be used to advocate for a political campaign or a ballot measure. The definitions of public facilities is very broad, includes certainly this building, but there's been cases where the PDC have attacked candidates who have postured themselves next to fire trucks or police vehicles, public equipment, and found that to be a violation of our laws. Big thing for school districts, we deal with it, see it all the time, is complaints to the PDC about school personnel involved in ballot measure campaigns while on duty. Turning back to your meetings, here's an example out of, again, a very nearby jurisdiction, Sumner. A candidate for city council began showing up at the public comment periods at the city council meetings, campaigning during his 3 minutes for election and attacking his opponent. And the question is, well, wait a second, does he have a right to use this public forum to attack and use it for campaign purposes? And the PDC ruled that he did not, and the city council in the city of Sumner was within its authority to limit and that comment and prevent the use of that public resource, the public comment period, for campaign type activities. Another example, somewhat ridiculous, you probably wouldn't take action, but if somebody showed up and wanted to talk for 3 minutes about the Boys and Girls Club car wash, thank you, nice idea. But what about if somebody came in during that 3-minute period and wanted to talk about the new restaurant that they're opening up? Are you going to allow your public comment period to be an advertiser's forum? Some of the issues that you don't think about but have occurred in other jurisdictions from time to time. Okay, what are the 3 exceptions where the school district can get involved? Action taken by governing bodies expressing support or opposition to ballot measures. So, this board can vote to support its upcoming ballot measure. If it does so, it must allow those who are opposed and who would, to the ballot measure to have time on the agenda to speak against it. City of Kent regularly, I believe the council has regularly adopted resolutions supporting the school district's election matters. That's something that cities can do as well. Actually, since the Kent School District's in 4 different cities, I guess you could get 4 city councils expressing positions in support of you over time. Another exception is elected officials responding to questions at press conferences. The other, and that includes your ability as an elected official to say, school board member X endorses city council candidate Y or county council member Z. You can, as an individual elected official, use your position in your endorsements of other candidates or in opposition to other candidates as well. That is not restricted because it's in you as an individual. The other is the normal and regular conduct of the agency. So before I came in, I saw the flyers that you have, for example, your materials that inform the public about the upcoming election. That is considered to be the normal and regular conduct of the agency. But I will just note that the PDC is paying attention to, particularly to social media use in the providing information on upcoming elections. And here with specific reference to the school district, RCW 28A32090 specifically allows you to expend funds for the purpose of preparing and distributing information to the general public to explain the instructional program and operation and maintenance of the schools and the district, so long as you don't try to influence the outcome of the election. You can put on your reader boards, vote on Tuesday, or vote in the general election. You can't say vote yes on those reader boards or in your materials. Okay. Any questions on that before we turn to the next topic? Yes.
All right, so let's say that we're putting a bond out and it's going to create a new additional space for preschool on current elementary buildings. And we're trying to explain the justification for, you know, our goals of equity and whatnot. Is that legal in that particular presentation?
Board Member Clark, I don't want to give a precise answer to a question that may be dependent on the words and phrases that are used in that publication. The PDC is very careful in scrutinizing these issues. A certain word or a phrase in a publication can give rise to a PDC complaint. I don't know if you've had a chance, certainly your general counsel, your staff, superintendent has looked at these issues and knows that the PDC has a long list of what you can and can't do in elections and the form of questions that you can ask in polling, for example. My reaction to your question is that that would be permissible information that you can provide, saying that with these bond proceeds, we would do X, Y, and Z, and that would assist the district in meeting these objectives. But again, without evaluating the specific language, I can't give you an absolute answer. But it strikes me that that's something that could be included.
Yeah, I mean, because quite obviously you're trying to explain to the public where the money's going. And that's why I really struggle with, I mean, realistically, buying new furniture is, I mean, a public health and public safety outcome. But I find myself being trapped in, you can't do anything except state where the money's going.
Well, you can say, here's the current conditions of the facilities, and here's what issues are created by the current condition. With the bond proceeds, we intend to do this, which will result in an alleviation or an elimination of the problems here. Yeah, is that advocacy? Probably not, but at some point, if you get so aggressive on it, the PDC might come down on you. Yeah.
Okay.
I would like some very specific answers. Did I hear you correctly? If I have somebody that I support for council or legislative thing, that I can list my name with my board position, and I'm okay to do that if I support them?
In response to that question, the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I would suggest that if you see campaign materials, whether they're websites or mailers that you get from candidates for office, you will often see a list of endorsements. And that list of endorsements will include the title of the official. So let me think of an example.
Oh, that's plenty.
In an election that you would be familiar with that just occurred last fall was the election of our new King County prosecutor. So, in the various listings of endorsements in their campaign materials, you saw that, for example, one of the candidates was the mayor of Federal Way. You saw a list of endorsements from Mayor blank from this city, Mayor Y of this city, Mayor Z of this city, council member blank. So you saw all of those officials' titles listed with their names as endorsing, and that's permitted. And so you could say school board member as well. Other questions?
I have a non-related specifically to ethics, but for determination of roles. I made a mistake in an executive session when I referred to my colleagues as board members as being part of administration. Now, I fully recognize they aren't, but I am stuck with when you, as a citizen, go to look at the structure of the school district, you do see the board and the superintendent in management roles. So is there a terminology for that?
I don't think that there is a uniform way for that reference. Colleague, member, board member, administrator. I don't know how you would say it in the context other than the issue that you're dealing with, because you're absolutely right. There are cases when, situations in which the board is acting in an oversight and technically an administrative capacity. That's unusual, but it does occur from time to time. It certainly, in terms of a scale, it is nowhere near when you're talking about county commissioners whose roles are both legislative and executive at the same time. And it's not as extreme as a council mayor, strong mayor form of government, where the mayor has absolute authority as a matter of law. The authority of the school superintendent is primarily contractual and delegated authority. And so there's again, on the scale, it differs from government to government, but in most cases, in particularly large school districts, the superintendent is the administrator, the chief executive, and the board is the legislative body. And how you refer to each other, I'll leave to your good decision.
I have a specific question, and I asked this of our legal counsel, Mr. Brockville, and I think he probably gave me real safe advice, but I wanted to do some phone banking as a private citizen in my own house with my own phone on the recent bond, and he advised me against it, and I have listened to him.
Okay, we're gonna talk about that in greater detail, but if you use a telephone, a text service, any kind of social media or other communication device, I strongly urge you to have all of your school district activities segregated, separated, independent from your personal use. We spend public clients hire us, and we are regularly having to deal with recovering materials from personal computers, business computers, because they responded to an email that they got on their personal computer or their business computer. Personal cell phones. talking with another attorney in the office just this afternoon on this various issue. We do our due diligence, as we're required to do in defense of the local government in response to a Public Records Act, and say, search your phone. Tell us what you have. And they, under the law, you can provide an affidavit saying that you did this and there is not anything there, or here's what was there. And that's presumed to be valid. But then, 6 weeks, 2 months later, we start getting information that there was stuff on the cell phones. And that's why I really encourage you to segregate those activities. Because if anything comes into those systems, whether you intend it to or not, relating to Kent School District affairs, then you're going to that's going to be subject to the Public Records Act disclosure. And it's very expensive for you and time consuming, and very expensive for the district and burdensome on both you and the district to have to recover that stuff. I don't know how much stronger I can say it. It's just a field full of landmines.
So you're saying as a private citizen, in my own house phone that I pay the bill, that I can't politically say anything?
Oh, you can say anything you want, but if it relates to the school district, then it's school affairs, and that's that is a Public Records Act matter and disclosable.
And if it came back that it was on my house phone,
Again,
my own house,
yeah, it's still. Let me give you an example, just to be clear. The city of Puyallup went to our Supreme Court on that very issue, saying elected officials have First Amendment rights, and the Public Records Act is in derogation of those constitutional rights, and therefore those First Amendment rights of a private citizen, even though I'm a school board member, should prevail. Court said no. Because when you took on the role of an elected official, starting back at the very beginning of this program, you have a different role. You can't say, today I'm a private citizen and tomorrow I'm a school board member, or I was a school board member yesterday and I may be tomorrow, but today I'm a private citizen. You're a school board member 24/7. And that responsibility, and so if you're talking about school district business, it's a public record.
well, I mean, if they wanted a public record of my home phone, they could have it. But if I'm just calling and saying vote for, I'm not saying vote for it, I'm just saying the bond is coming up as a private citizen
if
on
there's-
my own phone,
yeah, if
they
there's-
can have all the records they want. I
Yeah.
haven't crossed a line,
That's right.
have I?
Oh, you haven't violated an Open Public Meetings Act by doing that, but you would be crossing the line and violating the Public Records Act if, in response to a request, you didn't produce all of that
Yes, I
information.
understand that.
Yeah.
My question is, I still have a right, as a private citizen, in my own home, with my own phone, to have a voice.
Yes, you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You just don't, but just be sure you preserve it consistent with the district's policies.
Got it.
And that's the pain.
Thank you.
Just wanted to ask the board if you guys want to take a 5-minute break. Is that all?
Sure.
You sure? Or we can,
I think we're pretty close to.
are we, how close are we?
These next portions are pretty quick.
Okay.
And then you could maybe break before the insurance presentation.
Okay,
Probably a good idea.
yeah.
Yeah, my note here is, you remember the Hill Street Blues series that was on some years ago? Sergeant Esterhazy used to send out the troops after the morning briefing. Let's be careful out there. You have to be particularly careful these days and age because there's so many people, community and the auditor and others looking at you. This is an issue we're going to cover very quickly. It's not one that you're going to face very often. The only time I think you're going to face this is when you're dealing with contract non-renewals on teachers. In those situations, you are subject to, that's a quasi-judicial proceeding. You cannot sit on such an issue if you are biased, you've prejudged the issue, or you are prejudiced against an individual or one side or the other. Doesn't matter whether you favor the administration or you favor the employee, you can't do it. Because in these situations, you've got to be squeaky clean, including the violation of the appearance of fairness doctrine. Again, it doesn't even have to show a violation. If it appears that you may be acting unfairly in your conduct in that matter, the conduct, your action as a board may be overturned. That was the basis, as I referenced, the Algona Civil Service Commissioner's removal from the commission, because even if he said he was going to act fairly, it would violate the appearance of fairness doctrine because of his close relationship with the fire chief, or excuse me, the police chief who had been terminated. To take us away from the personnel area where you typically come into play to a Pierce County land use decision, just to emphasize something that the courts will say. This is a case involving a gravel pit permitting in Pierce County. And here's what the court said in response to an appeal from the Pierce County Council's determination to reject the gravel pit. It is apparent that the council gave little consideration to the merits of the application and that it disregarded the facts set forth in the examiner's findings. The council seems to have heard clearly the citizen complaints and the comments of one of its own members while disregarding the record. We cannot escape the conclusion, in view of the evidence in support of the application, that the council based its decision on community displeasure. Wait a second. Isn't that what we're elected to do, to react to what the community wants? When you're dealing with policy and the general resolution actions of the school, yes, you can react to what the community says. But the courts will always remind us that you always have to follow the policies and standards that the law applies to your conduct. This is an unusual case, but it's a good example of where the public had this huge cry out. The elected officials responded to that community outrage, and the courts didn't have any trouble throwing out the decision. It was improper to deny the permit to the applicant who throughout the application process has demonstrated a willingness to mitigate any and every legitimate problem. This is not a case that you are going to see at the school board, but it is a reminder that our courts, when they are evaluating a complaint against your conduct, will determine whether or not you have followed the law and policy that guides the school district. And if you don't, courts will not hesitate to overturn it, even though the public may think otherwise. Okay, conflict of interest, again, goes back to where we started this. Well-established principles of common law and state statute prohibit a board member from participating in a matter that will specifically benefit the member. And in some circumstances, that interest is such as to prohibit the board member's involvement, or may even disqualify you from further service. The state statute we're referring to is the Code of Ethics for Public Municipal Officers, and that's 4223.030 that says you cannot be beneficially interested directly or indirectly in any contract or accept directly or indirectly any compensation, gratuity, or reward in connection with such contract. There are remote interest exceptions that we're not going to cover today. There are a lot of them involving school districts, such as the ability of the school district to hire one of your spouses to drive school buses, as an example. I mean, because of small rural school districts, who else is going to be there to help? But when you deal with that, then you call Mr. Brockvogel and have him review the remote interest exceptions. For a city council member, another example, they set their own utility rates just as they set the public's utility rates. That's a specific remote interest exception acknowledged by the statutes.
Steve, if I can, back to quasi-judicial roles. I mean, clearly, school boards have to deal with the public interpreting something and wanting a particular action. Now, I'll make up an absurd example, but nevertheless, it's clear. The girls' basketball coach is a man. The parents were upset in what they thought was a poor showing, and they want they want women in the role of girls coaches, and so they want that person not renewed at that position. We have to enter that discussion simply as neutrals, but press coverage can obviously begin to distort the entire conversation. So, comment on that.
Thank you. I will comment on it other than say that that same issue would apply. I think there's more discretion certainly with coaches, but in the renewal of contracts, you are guided by statutory principles. And you know that if you engage in a non-renewal for an unsubstantiated basis or based upon an arbitrary or capricious basis, then your actions can be overturned. And if you're basing a decision based upon the sex of an individual, then you're potentially subject to a claim of sex discrimination. And it goes both ways. Discriminating against men, discriminating against women. Our courts have told us we cannot limit the opportunity for corrections officers in men's facilities to only men. Women have a right to serve in corrections facilities, and men have the right to serve in women's corrections facilities, except in rare circumstances, personal body checks and things like that. But you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, and so it's who's the best candidate, male or female? It could be either, and you can't make that decision based on sex. And yes, you may be subject to attack by members of the public, but again, you have to be guided by the law and policy, and the law says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. This is, we talked about the remote interest. No officer may use his or her position to secure special privileges or exemptions for yourself or others. This is one that isn't looked at very closely. But doing favors for a constituent may get you in a lot of trouble, or trying to do favors. Because you only act as a board, the board is a buffer for your individual actions. But you have to be careful here about making promises or acting on behalf of others, because it can subject you to liability. What happened in the Spokane County case cited here? County commissioners voted to eliminate the position of planning director. Planning director sued, and the court, he said that the reason I was terminated, or my position was eliminated, was because the county commissioners wanted to do a favor for a developer friend, and the court said that could give rise to a violation of this particular statute, and therefore a violation of law. Again, fairly common sense. You can't receive gifts or gratuities. Your exclusive compensation is your board member compensation and reimbursement for your school district expenses incurred. But that's all you can get. Now, if you go to a conference and there's meals served or drinks served, that's fine. It's part of a organized effort. But you shouldn't be out there taking expensive gifts or other benefits from contractors along the way. There is no exception in this statute for a cup of coffee or a lunch. The state employee statute has a de minimis exception. The local government law does not. And so at the state level, $25 or $50 lunch is fine. But at the local level, it would still arguably be a violation of law. Most local governments don't pay attention to that. The state auditor doesn't pay attention to it. The attorney general doesn't pay attention to it. But you should be aware and be careful about that. I've had public lawyers who have been in our offices insist upon paying for their own coffee that we would normally serve anybody in our offices.
So you're saying if I go out with a friend to have a coffee, they can pay for it? I have to pay for it?
You can, certainly. If it's a social engagement,
Right.
Your neighbor gives you a cake on your birthday or brings over some cookies, no big deal. That's your friend, your neighbor. It has nothing to do with the school district. But if it's school district related, then you have to be careful.
Does that include the other way around? Like I can't buy, if I meet with a constituent, I shouldn't buy their coffee as well?
No, you can.
They just can't buy it from me.
Yeah, you've just got to be careful about how much somebody is spending on you who does business with the school district.
Got it.
So we had a joint meeting with the city of Covington and their council, and they gave us a swag bag, which had in it water bottle, a cookie, and some things. Was that acceptable?
And again, what is this for?
It was a joint meeting between the school district and the city of Covington, their council and mayor, and they kindly gave us a nice little bag with a rather inexpensive
there's
water bottle and a cookie, and, I mean, am I supposed to not accept that?
No, that's fine.
It has a dollar amount.
That is a meeting-related, it's like if you go to a meeting and they serve lunch, there's no issue there. Okay. If you go to a meeting with the Covington City Council and they provide a water bottle and a cookie, that is not a violation of law.
We just have to be careful, that's all.
Yeah.
That's not an issue. We talked about conflict of interest. We talked about your fiduciary role. Here's what it says in the statute. You cannot, as a school board member, accept employment or engage in business or professional activity that might reasonably cause you to disclose confidential information acquired by reason of your position. So again, if I'm in my capacity as a lawyer, if I learn something from the school district, I can't tell my client that, and I'm immediately violating my relationship with that client. But this is what the law says to you. And of course, we talked about the executive session issues. You cannot disclose information that is otherwise gained by reason of your position or use that information for your personal gain or benefit. And when it says your personal gain or benefit for others as well. And we're not going to do it today, but if there's a long list of other statutes, graft, corruption, there's a specific statute on taking payment from union officials, and similar type, taking payments from contractors. There is a huge list of state statutes that impact your conduct as public officials. And just reminding you that those controls, whether they're in law or policy, will continue to apply to you throughout your term of office. So let's summarize where we've been, and then you can take a break. On the issue of immunity, we'll talk about that more, or you will be talking about that more, and certainly in relation to your liability insurance coverage, but we really do encourage you to consider and adopt a policy providing for the procedures and indemnification of officers and directors and staff of the district. Violations of the OPMA, despite the longevity that we've had in dealing with that statute, remain an issue and continue to show up. The Richland recall issue, the City of Black Diamond recall cases a few years before that in South King County, still, those are all OPMA related. Actions contrary to the district and the advice of counsel may jeopardize your insurance coverage, as you'll hear later on. You have, under almost any policy that I'm aware of, a duty to cooperate with the insurer, and if you're out doing things that are inconsistent with the defense of a particular claim, you could be losing your coverage. And as you'll be talking more, officers and directors coverage is very important, and you'll learn more about that. So be sure that when you are acting for the district, you're acting within the scope and course of your duties as a district board member, and not acting inconsistent with that fiduciary responsibility to protect yourself, to keep the protection, because when you are working for and on behalf of the district and within the scope and course of your district roles, you're protected by law. The district may be liable, but you are individually protected. Let me give you one example in closing. City of Spokane, neighbors came in, complained about this building that they saw. The city council said, oh, well, let's stop that. Don't issue the permit for that. City attorney says, you can't do that. That's not your authority. City council said, no, we'll just see what the developer does, and directed the city manager and the planning director not to issue the permit. Supreme Court said the city council members acted outside of their authority. City manager, I mean, think of the superintendent in this context, acted outside of his authority by following the direction of the city council, because the city council doesn't have any authority to control the administration in that context. And as a result, all of them were found to have violated the law. And the city of Spokane didn't have insurance coverage for a lot of that $1 million worth of liability that it was facing as a result. So be careful. Last point I want to leave you with is from one of our esteemed jurists from some time ago. Louis Brandeis said, the most important political office is that of the private citizen, and we are always reminded of that, particularly in a session like this tonight, where you learn that when you take on the role of a school board member, you actually lose some of the protections that you have as a private citizen. So tonight we've talked about board member roles and responsibilities as a fiduciary. We've talked about the issues that you face with public comment and community engagement, and some of the issues, particularly in this tense environment, sometimes conflict environment that we're dealing with. And we've talked about legal exposures, both to yourself and your district that might arise when you act in derogation of policy and law that lays the foundation for you as the district. And I guess I'll just say, you always know where to find me, or you can get to me through your general counsel. Happy to take any further questions, but I know this has been a lot in a short amount of time.
Any question? Thank you, it was really,
Thank you.
Great. Now, thank you, DeGiulio, for the very informative, and it was a lot, but it was, like I mentioned earlier, we had meant to do this one quite some time, but thank you for your time. We're
Happy to
going
do
to
it.
suggest
yeah.
we
I
could
mean,
take a
if-
quick
If you guys don't,
3 to 5 minute break,
yeah,
and then we'll get
stand
started.
up, stretch out,
Yeah.
you know, we've been sitting since 5 o'clock.
I also need a diagram.
Great.
Okay, we're back from 5-minute break. I will turn it back to Israel.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Farah. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Brockvogel to go ahead and introduce our next presenter. Mr. Brockvogel.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, members of the board. I have with us tonight Chris Lawrence, who's with Propel Insurance. She's our broker, and she wants to talk to us and has graciously agreed to sit through Steve's presentation and the evening's events to talk to us about directors and officials' liability insurance. That's a separate sort of policy that sits with the general liability insurance, and it applies to claims that are made against directors and officers of the corporation. And so with that, I will turn it over to Chris, and she will take us through just a very brief 5-10 minute discussion about it. And she's got some slides too. Chris?
Well, good evening. The good news is I only have 8 slides, so we'll get through that pretty quickly. And I need to be able to share my screen, and currently someone else is occupying that.
We'll get to that right away. Just 1 second.
Uh-huh.
Give her a screen share.
Look at the carrot right here.
Okay.
Or drop down. New share.
Gotcha.
Just give her a screen share.
Multiple
Gotcha.
participants.
Okay.
There you go.
That good?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
And she can share.
Okay, yeah, put this one
Close that out.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Try that. See if that works.
There we go.
You got it.
Okay, can you see my screen where it shows Propel and Kent School District?
Not quite yet. Hold on just a sec.
There we go.
There we go.
Go.
Gotcha.
Okay. So, a little bit about me. I have been in the insurance industry for almost 45 years, about 30 of that working with public schools and public entities. So I've learned a lot along the way. I play professional, or almost professional, senior ranked volleyball these days. I like to quilt as my therapy, and I'm of the age where it's all about pickleball. So I don't know if you can relate to that, but that is the grade, right? So district liability insurance, you are part of an insurance pool in the state of Washington. Every school district in the state belongs to one of 3 or 4 insurance pools. And those pools provide a number of liability coverage components. General liability, it protects us from bodily injury and property damage allegations. Auto liability, for those things that happen due to our use of our vehicles. Cyber liability, employee benefit liability, we make an error in administering benefits. And then we've got some miscellaneous professional, that's for our licensed staff, like our nurses, our athletic trainers, that type of thing. And there is Washington state law that protects you as an employer when there's a workers' comp issue that might give rise to a liability situation. What we're going to talk about today briefly is the wrongful acts coverage. And the most common terminology under wrongful acts is your employment practices liability coverage, your educational legal liability. Some may refer to that as professional liability. Some may refer to that as errors and omissions coverage. And then your board liability, sometimes referred as directors and officers liability. All of that falls under the wrongful acts coverage form. And that is where an insurance carrier agrees to pay those amounts for which a covered party becomes legally obligated to pay as damages because of a wrongful act to which this coverage part applies. You, as a school district entity, is a covered party. You, as individual board members, or collectively as a board, is part of the covered party. So are your employees and your volunteers, all while doing your duties and your job in good faith, right? You're acting accordingly and what we would expect, and therefore coverage would extend to all of those different parties. Coverage is triggered when a claim is made, not when the date of occurrence occurred. So we can see a claim today for something that occurred in the 80s, in the 90s. So there is no cutoff date for an occurrence under this policy form. You have $30 million in limits for any one claim. You have $30 million for an annual limit or annual aggregate. So there is a cap annually for 30 million, and your pool buys 100 million annually. So every year there's a new bucket of 30 million for the district and 100 million for the pool. And I talked about the retro date. Any questions on this slide? Pretty straightforward. Okay. In every directors and officers policy or wrongful acts policy, they define what they want to cover as a wrongful act, right? Your coverage is defined as any actual or alleged tortious error, act, omission, misstatement, misleading statement, neglect, or breach of duty committed by a covered party, including but not limited to violations of civil rights, employment practice violations, misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance in the discharge of duties, individually or collectively, that result directly but unexpectedly and unintentionally in damages to others. So the golden rule about insurance is that we expect a certain activity to go on. So that is your discharge of duties. And if those duties, while you're doing those duties, you cause damages to another party and they bring a suit against you or the district or the board itself as a group, then at the very basis coverage, it says, okay, we'll listen to what the allegations are. The insurance policy is now triggered to the extent that we did not intentionally do something, we were acting within the scope of our duties, and the damages that did occur to another party were not expected. Okay? Typical exclusions is intentional acts. When we know what we're about to do will cause damages to another party and we proceed anyway. Criminal acts are not covered by insurance of any type. When we have one board member suing another board member, that would not be covered under a policy. If you're acting as a board member on another entity, this policy doesn't follow you as an individual, right? It's only for your actions as a Kent School District board member. The exception to that is if Kent said, would you please represent us on the WASDA board or some affiliated organization, then we would be excess of what coverage they may carry for you. So minimizing your risk as a board member. So you should have well-written policies and procedures and understand them. The number one problem we run into is we have policies and procedures we don't follow. That is the kiss of death in the courtroom. If the rules don't apply to you, then the insurance protection may not. So do not stand outside of your own policies and procedures. And if you can't live with it, then work to amend what isn't working. Follow your legal counsel. When you choose to stand alone, you may be on your own for liability protection. Never make a decision knowing it is wrong. Seems very obvious, right? But insurance carriers always have language in there about intentional acts. And one of the things that came up during COVID, there was a lot of questions around, well, our board is considering, you know, something around the mask. It's very similar to what Richland ended up doing in that whole situation. Well, that was an intentional act. And so our position was, the insurance carrier would have a good argument that if you go down that road, that's an intentional act and you knew the outcome. Not only that, it was probably breaking the law. And insurance isn't going to address that either. So just understand that when you act intentionally, knowing it is a wrongdoing and there's likelihood of a wrongdoing, that you could jeopardize the coverage under the district's wrongful acts coverage. Always act within the scope of your duties. I deal with a lot of public schools, a lot of private schools, a lot of nonprofits. They all have boards, and outside of employment-related practices suits, which is the leader, the next most common issues we end up with is board members that become administrators and kind of cross lanes. Your best defense as an individual person, as a board member, is your delegation to your superintendent. You set the policies, the procedures, the trajectory of where you want the district to go, and it is up to your superintendent to get you there. And then you hold them accountable. So don't interfere with HR issues, don't become an administrator, avoid individual meetings. You have to act as one body, and you must communicate as one body. I see issues around, there's this balancing act you have to do. On your political side, your constituents want to know what you do as an individual board member and how you feel about things. But when you're a board member, you need to act as one body and communicate as one body. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope, but be conscious of that. Avoid personal opinions and comments. You know, the attorney mentioned what happens in executive session stays in executive session, right? You can come out and say, well, we've discussed and the board decided, but you don't want to get in that this board member was for this, but this board member was for something else. You want to communicate as a whole body. Avoid bringing up surprises, right? Be proactive and an intentional listener. Those are all duties that the insurance carriers assume you are doing. The board members that, in my experience, that find themselves in a little bit of trouble or maybe end up without the insurance protection that they thought they might have, tended to not understand the role they were taking on. It's a big role. It's complex. Oftentimes we see a demeanor change, right? We have to be careful that we don't become experts where we really aren't. And that goes back to don't be the HR director, don't be the transportation director, don't be, you know, the capital projects organizer, all of those things. You may have personal experience in those areas, but as a board member, is that your lane? Okay? Schools are very dynamic, so you have to be very nimble. Setting policies is not the same as administering policies, you know that. You have to be able to accept the board decisions that may be contrary to your own. And this is that slippery slope between, if I'm going to vote for you, I want to know what your stance is on everything, right? And so we have this natural desire, right, to tell our opinion and maybe even to be contrary to what the group decided. That really doesn't fit into the duties of you as a board member. It might be as a political person, but not as a board member. Respond appropriately to complaints and concerns, and you know, everybody knows that they're all working on the same team. A couple of things that I think it was Steve that brought up. Fines and penalties, you guys are monitored and you have to answer to a lot of different entities, the state auditor, OSPI, all these bodies. And where they levy fines or penalties, fines and penalties are never insured under an insurance policy, right? Open Public Meeting Act violations, those are typically levied as fines. There's no coverage for when we are being sued because we didn't do something according to that. Same with Public Records Act. There's no coverage for those issues either. And prohibitive acts under the law, that would mean a criminal act. Therefore, there would be no coverage for that as well. The good news is, in the 30 years I've been doing this, there's been very little lawsuit activity towards board members where coverage didn't exist. However, when that does happen, it can be very painful. And nobody likes surprises. So the key is understanding your role, making sure that you stay in your lane, and communicate and operate as one body. So I hope that doesn't cloud things even more for you. But like I said, the good news is I've seen very little true denial of coverage. Where we thought there should be coverage, but there's very clear activity that you could get into that coverage was never intended for. So with that, I'll just take any questions you might have, or I know it's getting late.
Any questions?
No questions. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Mr. Brockbubble to close this off for tonight.
Thank you, Chris, so much for helping us out and the slides, and those will go in our brief bank for future reference, so thank you. Board, I'm always available if you want to talk. I love talking about this stuff. If you ever want to just sit down and have coffee or whatever, I'm always around. So there's many more issues that'll come up, and we're trying to put together, using some of these concepts tonight as a basis for new board orientation. And we may end up going through this together again numerous times, and we'll get better at it.
I like that.
Yeah, continue.
Yes.
I'll turn it over to.
Thank you. If there are no more other discussions, it is 7:54, and the meeting's adjourned.